Hey everybody, I know it's been a while, but it's Mowing with Dave number 6 or 7. I can't remember. It's one of those. I think you're going to really like this one today. This is about one of the most often asked questions I get asked. And you know what that is? Why don't we sound like the record? And I'm going to address that because there's some myths that I want to dispel, and I am going to prove it to you today. We're going to do a little dog and pony show, and I think you're really going to enjoy this. Now, I would assume that most of you, your experience with music is one in which you haven't spent much time or any time in a recording studio. And in a recording studio, we can do some very, very interesting things. But before I even get into that, let me just say this. When you download that iTunes song from Hillsong or whatever, most of the time, at least, and this is a conservative estimate, 200 man hours have been spent on that 4-minute song. 200 hours at least, and multiple people working on it. So that's number one. Number two, and if we spent 200 hours in rehearsal, I think you'd have my head, but that's another story. But let me say this. Let's just talk about this for a minute because I think you're really going to like it. I've got a set of, this is just a bass drum and a snare drum, kind of like a marching snare and a bass drum. And I've recorded this. And I'm going to show you something. If you look down here in this interface where it says True Strike, do you see how it says CLO, STG, and FAR right here where my cursor is? That stands for close, stage, and far. And we can actually, in the studio, have separate microphones recorded for whatever we record. So in other words, I can have microphones right on the drums, then I can also have them on the stage, and I can also have them in the congregation. And I can give you a perspective, and that's where the close, stage, and far comes from. I can show you what each one's going to sound like. For example, if you were standing on the stage, but not near the drums, but on the stage, this is what they would sound like. Okay? Now, if I move them to close, this is what the drummer hears. These are the mics right next to the drummer. That's how he hears it. Very tight. And then if I go out to the congregation and listen to what those drums sound like out here, I choose far. Listen to this. Very, very different. Now watch as this gets a little more interesting. I've got a cello part that I recorded here, and I'm going to just let you hear the cellos. Now watch what happens when I put the drums from the stage perspective with that. Listen to the cellos and watch how they get masked. You can still hear them, but you got to fight a little bit to hear them. Now watch this. I'm going to sweep this button right here from stage to close. Listen to what the drummer hears. Stage. Close. Now I'll go to the congregation and put it far. So what happens, guys, is in the studio, what we do is we have mics all over the place, and we can turn some on, turn some off to get the sound to be tighter. So when you download that song from iTunes, that work has already been done on that. And that's why some people will come to me and they'll go, you know, Dave, I went to this concert and they didn't sound anything like the record. And our first assumption normally is the musicians were playing too loud, or number two, the singers were off and the musicians were off as well. And that can definitely be. But typically what it is you're using your oral imagination. You're remembering that iTunes recording, which they've done all this stuff with, and you're comparing it to the live recording, which they can't do that as much. It's just impossible to do that. Now, there are some things we do on the board and some things that we can do to help that. And what I've always been taught by my musical mentors is to play to the room and try to get a good mix yourself with your voice, with the instruments and so forth to the room, and listen to the room as much as you're listening to yourself and everybody else. There's multiple levels of communication that go on when you're really playing well. And actually the live sound is a very cool sound when you learn to embrace it, but it's very different from the record. And I just wanted to prove that to you, that's some of the stuff. And I know this because I've worked on records where we spent 20 hours just on a snare drum sound. doing this kind of stuff to get it exactly right to sit with all the other instruments. So there's a lot more that goes into it when you listen to that recording than when you hear live. And even like like with the choir, when we work in the fellowship hall and then we go over to the stage, it does sound very different. It's not necessarily what you think as much as it is the room reacting on it. Now, we've put acoustical treatments in there to help that as well, but you're never going to get that sound that you have in your head that's a very tight sound. And the more instruments and the more voices you layer into it, the more reverberation that happens in the room. So that's why we do these kind of things in the studio. So I hope that clears that up so that you understand that a little bit better. And that was Moment with Dave number 7. A little longer than a minute, but I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.